Hi guys, it's Olivia here from Olivia's Catastrophe, and today I'm here to give you a discussion video which is about sex and new adult in fantasy novels. Now, this is going to be a three-part type of thing. These videos might not be coming out consecutively, so in this one I'm just going to discuss and kick off the discussion. In the second one we'll be looking closer at some young adult or new adult books and taking them by their scenes and discussing those books in particular. And then thirdly, in the final video, we're going to get some other booktubers to come and join in me with my discussion so that we can see what more people think on this matter. But for now, it'll just be me discussing with you guys, and also I'll be referencing The V-Girl by Maya Roberts, which is the book that has prompted this discussion. So when I say reference The V-Girl, I don't mean I'm going to point out certain scenes. You don't have to have read The V-Girl to enjoy this discussion, and there will be no spoilers for The V-Girl. So before we can start this discussion, we need to define new adult and young adult. Now, I've heard this definition that seems to go around that new adult is for 18 to 25-year-olds, and then if the character's 18 to 25, it's new adult, and if the character's younger than 18, then it's young adult. But then, like, what happens with 18? Because you're quite young at the same time you're an adult, so it's just like, that definition doesn't fit. And I have to say that for a long time, when the new adult genre first started, many years ago I guess, and I read it, new adult basically meant anything that was an adult romance with explicit scenes. That was the standard definition for new adult, but even I agree that that doesn't fit the bill anymore. So I want to say that new adult, for the sake of this discussion video, I'm giving the definition that new adult is for an 18-year-old plus who lives away from home. So I've come to that definition by personal experience. I'm 19, last year I was 18, and I would consider myself a young adult when I was living under my parents' permission, like under their care as an 18-year-old in their house, having secondary school experiences. But when I turned 18 and I went to university and I was living independently, you know, you've got to rely on your parents for money these days of uni because everything is expensive. But I was living outside of their care, like I was a bit more independent. I would then classify myself as a new adult because I was an adult and it was new to me, and I don't know where the limit is going to be for new adult. I think that really pertains to genre and also to the aim of the book that you're reading, but for the sake of this video that is going to be the definition of new adult. And now we have to define new adult in fantasy, because this is about fantasy reads, and it's different because in fantasy there's not many fantasies where people live with their parents until 18 and then they go to university and then they can be called a new adult, or they go and live alone and then they can be called a new adult. But most of these characters seem to do something that is out of the norm. Most of the characters seem to either become a leader, whether they want to or not, or they seem to have some significant event coming up, which is a way that they show maturity. For example, in the Hunger Games, that would be, you know, taking the place of Prim. She would become a new adult because now she's in the Hunger Games, now she's important. Or if we're going to be giving other examples, let's take The Wrath of the Dawn by Renee Adea. She decides to go and live with this guy who's killing everyone, and she leaves home to go and do that. So I guess in fantasy there is a point which will be different for every book where you can say that the person is a new adult. For example, Feyre leaving her house and going to this fantasy world with the Beast. Okay, so I'm not just referencing The V-Girl, clearly. Okay, I messed up already. So that could be the definition for new adult in fantasy, and that makes that book a new adult read. Cool, we've got those two definitions down pat and out of the way. But now, should we even have sex in fantasy books? Why and why not? That is the next part of the discussion. And I think that you should have sex in books. For starters, because we're humans, and it's not like what we do, like the only thing we do is have sex, but I mean it's what we do. It's how we show love, it's how we show emotions, it's something we enjoy. So if you're going to have humans, or I mean it doesn't have to be humans, because fantasy, you know, you've got dragons, you've got mermaids, you've got all this, but if you've got humans within your fantasy, them having sex, it's a normal thing, it's natural. So you don't have to exclude it, but you don't have to include it either. I think it really depends on what you are doing with your book. So I'm not going to draw on the V-girl yet, but let's just not give specific scenes, but just think about A Court of Thorns and Roses. Sex is kind of used as a way to show who you have romantic interest at the time, just as humans do it, just as humans use it sometimes as well for that purpose. So it can be used for that purpose, it can just be used for other ways, it can just be used to show intensity between people. Of course, you don't have to have sex to do that. You can have a non-explicit book that has different ways of doing that, but why can't we use sex? It's a normal thing. I don't think it's a big problem. Of course, it switches your target audience, but if we are in the new adult genre, your audience is already the more mature teens within fantasy. The next question is, should we have sex as a main theme in new adult or young adult fantasy? That is a very, very good question. Sex is now being used more and more often in young adult contemporaries and not skipped over to make the book non-explicit or clean, but actually included so that teenagers have an idea of what the first time will be like, or normalizing sex and removing the taboo around it and making it seem, not making it seem as something that everyone does, but making it more normal, making it less taboo, making it more everyday, because hey, sex is kind of everyday and ingrained in life, which is good. It's good that contemporaries are doing it. But then in fantasies, whenever there's sex in fantasies, we seem to be a bit like, wow, this is unexpected. What we're going into the genre here for is we're going in to escape into this new world, we're going in for battles, we're going in for magic. We're not going in to see characters having sex. But at the same time, I do think it can be included as a main feature as well. What's not to say that feminist ideas and sexual desire cannot exist in this fantasy world? How can it not? Maybe sex also has a taboo in this fantasy world and it needs to be developed into the fantasy storyline. Maybe feminism is not a thing yet, or it's overly a thing and it needs to be developed in this storyline. I don't see how it should be something that is surprising to come across into the genre, because fantasy as a definition is not a storyline. Fantasy is the world building and the elements of magic or fantasia or fantasy that you have in the book. It's a setting, really. The genre is a setting, and in the creatures and elements. It's not actually the storyline. So sex as a storyline in fantasy can be allowed and should be included more often. I'm surprised that we don't see it. Some people say they are tired of feminism and like females being oppressed in fantasy. Well, they can also be unoppressed and you can totally switch the grid, like Naomi Alderson, I believe, did with The Power, where women have all the power. I don't know if that's fantasy, for example, but you can switch the grid. You can play around with this thing. You can play around with femininity and feminism, but you can also play around with sex and gender roles as well. I don't understand why people are surprised when they come across sex in fantasy. It should be normalised in that genre as well. And should sex be used as a main theme? Now let's get to talking about using the reference of the V-girl. Sex is clearly a main theme in this one, especially as it's about virginity. V-girl. You kind of get it. There's a lot to this book, and I'll leave a link to my blog review down below, my Goodreads review down below. But yes, sex is a main theme in this one, but it doesn't take away from the dystopian fantasy world as well. That world building is still threaded through. There's still other storylines ingrained here, but sex is a main theme, and it was more easier for me to read this one and to think about sex in a normalized way, because sometimes what happens if you're talking about and discussing sexual themes in contemporary is that it seems a bit too close to you. We live in this world and now we're getting this very, not heavy theme, but it can be controversial. It can be very controversial, and it's set in the real world, so then it's just really either preachy or getting at you. But then if you take it to a fantasy world where there's a bit of distance between your reality and the discussion in this different world, sometimes it makes it easier to process points and to see them open-mindedly. So I can say that fantasy is very good for doing that. Now here's the next question. Should we explore the less conventional sexual desires or acts in fantasy? So I'm just not only talking about, okay, doing this on camera is hard, but I'm not just talking about heterosexual, straightforward sex, but there's also loads of other different types of sex that you can have. Bit weird to film this one on camera, but should we also have that in your books? And I say yes. For example, in this one we have a voyeuristic, I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, voyeuristic sex, where the main character, who is the V-girl in this one, she actually watches other people having sex. Not like she has to for the fantasy world, but she just ends up doing it because there's also these characters who enjoy having public sex all the time. So it kind of works for both of them. And it was really unique for me to read this because as much as I read new adult books quite often and I read a lot of explicit content, I never really read about people who enjoy public sex. I never really read about people who are voyeuristic with their sexual tastes, and it was just like, of course, I mean, of course that exists, but we don't really see it in books because every time it talks about sex it's always the traditional type of sex. And I do think that if we're going to try and take away the taboo around sex, we should also try and take away the taboo around other sexual methods and ways of having sex. Okay, then I'm going to be talking about LGBT plus sex in books. The only example I have for this one is contemporary, which is really sad because sex is not just for the contemporary genre, and that's the upside of Unrequited by Becky Albertelli, where there's just one moment where the characters discuss the idea of losing your virginity and how one of the characters, who is, I believe, bisexual, she may just be lesbian, I cannot remember, I'm very sorry about that, but she says that virginity should not just be, you know, the act of penetration in sex, because that just takes it away from, for example, lesbians who don't have, you know, heterosexual penetrating sex, but it's still, you know, sex, and you can still lose your virginity that way within her opinion. Maybe you dispute that idea, maybe you don't, but whether or not you agree with it, it's a very interesting debate. But I can't think of any references for that in fantasy, and I think that just shows that we have a lack of LGBT plus characters taking main roles or having sexual discussions or desires in fantasy. And as we're normalising sex, we should do it for all orientations and across all genres. So I think that's also something that's very important to note. And then the last one, which is also a very hard one to talk about when it comes to literature, is rape in books and whether it should be included or not. Some people say yes, we should include it because it's the only way to become more open-minded, to become more understanding of what people go through and their storylines. Yes, 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 I definitely agree with all of that. I mean, reading The Girl in the Broken Mirror, I have a review for that up there and I'll link it down below. It was very hard for me, and my thoughts and feelings on that reflect, you know, what I'm thinking about when it comes to reading about rape. But in fantasy, you don't really have rape as a problem. It's just non-existent, and with the fact that 1 in 4 women have the chance, like, your chances of being raped as a woman is like 1 in 4, it's crazy that we just take away that culture when it comes to fantasy books. I believe that I've read reviews for An Ember in the Ashes, and I haven't read that one myself, but I do know that people say that rape is mentioned a lot in that one, and also rape is kind of discussed in The V-Girl by Maya Roberts as well. But just to think about the amount of books that are fantasy that have rape included in them, it's just very interesting that I can't think of that many, and I just feel like we need more sexual representation across all genres, because as much as contemporary is great for discussing those themes because it's real life, we do need to remember that it should be normalised across all genres. There's some people who don't read the contemporary genre at all, and they're missing out on, I'm not saying like they're missing out on these themes that should be normalised across all genres, if you know what I mean. When it comes to feminism, when it comes to discrimination, when it comes to any political theme, it doesn't have to be very political or controversially put into the book, but it should still be included to make readers think. So that's the opening for this discussion. So next time I'm going to be taking books and taking certain scenes or certain references. I know I referenced some books here, but I was referencing them as a whole without being very specific, but in the next one I'll be taking the books that are mentioned in my fantasy haul, link to that up below and down below, so you can see which books I'll be mentioning and really highlighting the scenes where it mentions that and what people have said or thought about those scenes being included that way. And yes, I would just love to hear about you guys. Like, a discussion should not be a one-way thing. I love to talk to you guys in the comments about what you think about the definition of young adult and new adult, whether it should be included in fantasy, whether sex should be included in fantasy, what type of sex are we missing out on, what type of sex should we see more represented more often, whether rape is supposedly supposed to be put in there or not, or whether it's something that we should exclude altogether, as our aim in life is to exclude it from real life happenings altogether as well. So just don't only comment to me. If you go through other people's comments and you see interesting points that you also want to discuss with them, then also comment on their comments. Guys, please keep it friendly. We don't need to hate on each other. So please be nice when you're commenting towards other people. Just be considerate of other people's emotions and thoughts and feelings. And I cannot wait to discuss with you guys. Let me know any thoughts, any responses you have to any of these points. I could have said things wrong. Maybe I've just randomly said a line because I'm kind of spitting from my head here with a few bullet points. So if you've got anything you disagree or agree with me, please comment. I can't wait to talk to you guys. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, hit the subscribe button to see more, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to be updated every time I have a new video. I don't know when I'll get the next one out, but hopefully it'll be soon, so don't miss out on it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.